and welcome to another episode of POV, your favorite web political series. Now, as we are all preparing to go for the men's conference from the 12th to the 16th, I hope this episode will leave you in a good mood. So let's get it. So last week, the president invited leaders of all political parties that took part in last year's harmonized elections to attend a meeting to discuss a framework for dialogue. The goal of the meeting was for the nation's leaders to commit themselves to the principle of dialogue and working together to resolve the challenges facing the country. The dialogue is part of a promise given by the president to engage all stakeholders, including the church and civil society, to confront the national question. Now, although this was a framework discussion, a couple things came out of this. Number one, the parties agreed that there should be no precondition for the dialogue and that there should be no sacred issues during the discussions. It was agreed that both political and economic reforms should be implemented while political motivated violence should be shunned. 3, there was an agreed recognition of the importance of a collective effort to address the issues of Western-imposed sanctions. And last but not least, I think I need a drum roll for this one. 4 committees were set up. How many committees can one man have and surround himself with? Honestly, I guess when he called himself a listening president, he really wasn't joking. Anyway, the committee's responsibilities are as follows. The first will be to focus on the institutional framework of the dialogue. Number 2, the second would be to deal with the agenda items for the dialogue. The third was going to determine the convener of the dialogue, and the fourth one will be responsible for monitoring and evaluating the implementation of the agreed issues. Now for us, 2 controversial issues arose out of this. The first one is that you already broke one of your rules. Earlier we mentioned that the parties agreed that there should be no precondition for the dialogue, right? But in a speech before the talks, President Mnangagwa insisted that all parties should accept the results of the July 30, 2018 harmonized elections as a legitimate expression of the will of the people of Zimbabwe. That kind of sounds like a precondition to me. I mean, what if they said no? Would you just all go home? You know, Ncube was very vocal about the elections not being fair. Now she's all of a sudden agreeing to this. What happened? By stating this, the president inevitably implies preconditions to participate. Now, the second, of course, is that MDC Alliance leader advocate Nelson Chamisa boycotted the meeting, citing that it was not a genuine attempt to solve the crisis. Now, why is this big? Well, if the majority winner of the urban vote was not in attendance, then what are you discussing? The leaders who attended the meeting have a combined presidential vote of just 154,971, and their parties won less than 15% of the House of Assembly. Is Zimbabwe's voice truly being heard if there's such a vacuum? Now, the opposition party would also go on to say, and I quote, the MDC's position is that the dialogue process must be convened by an independent mediator and not one of the disputants. I mean, that just makes sense, doesn't it? Now, we all know Nelly Chams is a young man who would relish a chance to stick it to the old man, but was this a smart political move or a major step back in a much-needed process for the country? You know, tell us in the comment section. 2 days later, a national breakfast of prayer was held to open up the dialogue with churches and civil society. Chamisa attended, but the president didn't. Was this payback at the nation's expense? And if Wamba Diawamba was going to just attend the breakfast, why did he waste everyone's time boycotting the framework discussion? Now, advocate, as Mama's going with my snakes, dialogue. I don't know. But what I do know is that this process is too delicate for us to lose it with 2 elephants fighting. Let's watch and see what happens. Venezuela, the world's current #1 case study on the systematic destruction of a nation's integrity, economy, and people. Yes, many comparisons have been made between us and our Latin American cousins, and the 2 countries have become mainstream economic news. Many Venezuelans today face a nationwide uncertainty, hyperinflation, food shortages, fuel queues, and far from favorable international recognition. Sound familiar? Maybe it is. The situation is so bad in Venezuela that this guy, Juan Guaido, on the 23rd of January declared himself acting president. I mean, this guy just woke up one day and he said, listen, I am the captain now. But how does a person just wake up and just say he's the national leader of a country and have leaders of the free world, such as the United States, endorse such a move? Well, let's backtrack a little bit and find out. Venezuela's descent into economic and political chaos can be attributed to poor resource management, corruption, and an over-dependency on a single resource revenue stream. Now, for a long time in Venezuela, there was massive income inequality, with the elite enjoying the fruits of the country's wealth and not much love being spread around. But along came a hero, Hugo Chavez, who ran on a socialist platform that promised to uplift the lives of poor Venezuelans. So when he won, he used the country's massive wealth to uplift impoverished lower-class people. Things like free education, publicly run health programs, and massive food subsidies were all introduced under Chavez. And Venezuela was flourishing. But those things are very expensive to maintain. And when oil prices collapsed, the high bill of the government's socialist programs began to crush the economy. Venezuela failed to diversify when they had the wealth, so this had a major impact on the nation. Now here's where it gets interesting for Zimbabweans. In 2003, President Chavez also introduced foreign currency controls that caused a flourishing black market in dollars. Since then, Venezuelans wanting to exchange bolivars for dollars have had to apply to a government-run agency, and only those deemed to have valid reasons to buy dollars, like importing goods, have been allowed to exchange at a government-fixed rate. Now, with many Venezuelans unable to freely buy dollars, they turn to the black market. And we all know too well how a hyperactive black market causes chaos. Venezuelans today find themselves hit hard by hyperinflation. The annual inflation rate reached 1.3 million% last year. And by the end of 2018, prices were doubling every 19 days. I mean, what do we know about prices changing every couple of days? But how has the government tackled this inflation? Now, back in August last year, the government took 5 zeros off the old strong Bolivar currency and gave it a new name, the sovereign Bolivar. This meant that people no longer had to carry huge amounts of cash, but it didn't actually change their problems, as we all know too well as Zimbos. The new currency was part of an economic plan of measures which the government said would incredibly relieve Venezuela's broken economy. The government is also anchoring the new currency to the petro, a virtual currency the government says is linked to Venezuela's oil revenues. If this is sounding nostalgic, it's because it is. And it's also safe to say that these measures are not working for Venezuela. Venezuela as a nation have lost an average of 24 pounds in body weight. 9 out of 10 are living in poverty and 1 out of 10 have fled the country. The challenge on the ground is brought by the fact that Venezuelans are forced to earn a living using a government-mandated scale, but the economy really works on a black market scale. This means that their salaries remain stagnant, but the cost of living goes out of reach almost on a daily basis. Now, the scary thing about this is that when we started researching for this story, we wanted to have a nostalgic trip down memory lane where we could remember things like bearer checks and laugh at the good old days. But the crazy thing is Venezuela is not learning from us, and neither are we. We are literally repeating our mistakes less than a decade from when they were fixed. A mutual conclusion of this story for both Venezuela and Zimbabwe can be summed up and found in the words of George Satayana, who said, "Those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Those who do not remember their past are condemned to repeat their mistakes. Those who do not read history are doomed to repeat it, and those who fail to learn from the mistakes of their predecessors are destined to repeat them." Zimbabwe and Venezuela have to dig deep to learn how to bring their countries out of where they are. Zimbabwe maybe might not be too late to fix things around, but we'll have to see how things go on in this new dispensation. Now, this episode really got me thinking about what is going to be the legacy of this presidency? How are we going to remember all these guys after everything is said and done? And for me, it can be summed up by this. You see, the president right now is trying to replicate a process from Rwanda called umuganda. And that's a process where the government comes down to the community level to have intense conversations about how to move the country forward. And then ceremonially, they'll have a sweeping process in the streets or community days to symbolize the coming together of these ideas. Now, the dialogues that are happening now is just one part of it. The thing that's missing is our conversation. When do we get our dialogue? See, the goal of Umganda is to ensure that there's social buy-in by the people for the government's vision. The streets of Rwanda are not clean because the government mandated it. It's because the Rwandan people themselves take pride in being part of the government's vision. Now, hamungati pwanyire msika wedu mova mati, this is for the greater good of things, without actually having a dialogue with us. You cannot tell us that these things are going to be going up and these things are going to be going up without a proper conversation. Right now, the only dialogue I have with this government is when I walk into Bon Marché and I've got my fingers crossed saying, Maribaba, please, let the bread just be the same price as it was last week. That's not a dialogue. And in order for us to move forward with this government's vision, we need to have that conversation. Because as it stands, from a citizen's perspective, this government has the appearance of wanting to do the work without actually doing the work. Let's hope that this dialogue and the lessons that we can draw from Venezuela and our own past can allow us to start rebuilding Zimbabwe stronger and better. This is Kuda Mangwe wishing you a good morning, good afternoon, and good night.